from just the individual going to and from the fields, from the more isolated villages to district capitals that presumably should be harder targets. I think the best illustration of this growth in capacity was the attack on Mocimboa da Praia at the end of March, when they attacked that town by land and by sea, maintaining control of all the routes in and out of the town, and basically leaving when they were ready. And within 48 hours of departing that town, they attacked another district capital of Kisanga, just some short distance away. So as we see them growing in capacity, we also see their territorial presence expanding. We've seen this year, they continue to consolidate their base along the coast. We see countless attacks along the coast, but we also see them starting to probe further inland and with greater success. We see a huge presence along the main north-south road to the point where travelers who can will pay the extra money to take a longer circuitous route, thus avoiding the insurgents. They also have some small presence on the sea, as we saw in the attack against Mocimboa da Praia, and then again attacks against those fleeing some of this activity by boat. This kind of brings us to their strategy, which has been interesting to watch. You have to give them credit for avoiding a lot of the strategic mistakes that nascent insurgencies commit, sort of overreaching hubris that drives you to think that you can carry out operations, that you can sort of moving into the next stage of an insurgency before you're actually ready. They've avoided all of that. They've rebounded from some of the operations the government has launched against them. And we see when they move into these towns like Mocimboa da Praia, these capitals, they target, as Mamadou pointed out, the infrastructure, the medical facilities, administrative posts, or administrative buildings, the police stations, sometimes churches, anything that's part of the old order that they're trying to sort of overturn and recreate in their own sort of vision. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. So we see them focusing on government infrastructure while at the same time still attacking the odd village, still attacking civilians going in and out. We have seen they have not replaced the infrastructure they've destroyed, but we do see some occasional efforts at interacting with the civilians in a slightly more positive way, reports of providing them food and money, reports that they warn civilians of impending attacks. These are still greatly outnumbered by the reports of violence against civilians, but occasionally you'll see stories like this. At the same time, we'll see them met out justice, and there's one report of the insurgents encountering a man drunk on beer, and so they shot him for public drunkenness. I believe that this association with ISIS is also part of their strategy and marketing. They were very quiet in terms of like public propaganda until March, when they finally flew the black flag and laid out sort of their demands. Again, creating an image of sort of a fierce and connected organization, but still very much oriented towards the local grievances and trying to create a different sort of environment where they are. At the same time that they've been growing and showing this dynamism, the government still seems, at least publicly, to be struggling with what's going on and what to do about it. And for a long period, we saw different officials spell out a different story. These are evildoers, these are bandits, these are just disgruntled miners. But now what we hear is this is something that was imported from abroad, it's being funded and fomented overseas, and that misses the entire story. If that's your vision, that's your approach, then you're ignoring all those social, economic grievances that are underpinning this conflict, and resolving the conflict as a result will be very long in coming. The government still seems focused on using the security services to address the issues there, but they have not been up till now up to the task. We continue to see reports of lack of supplies, low morale, desertions in the face of combat. You constantly hear reports of how the government also abuses civilians, of arbitrary arrests, including journalists who are reporting on the conflict, shakedowns. Even this morning, a journalist in Mozambique was reporting on social media that the security services had returned to Macomia and we're shaking down civilians. And this approach really exacerbates the situation. The UN did a report, I think it was in 2017, where they interviewed former jihadis, and the vast majority of them joined their organizations in response to some government atrocity. And I suspect that when we talk about the group's growing strength and capacity, they probably don't have to try too hard to recruit when the alternative is what we see. So that's sort of so when you're a civilian, just to sort of wrap up, a civilian in this area is in a very difficult situation because the insurgency, despite what they say about advocating for poor Muslims, it doesn't necessarily treat civilians well in the slightest. And the security services that you should rely on to protect you aren't really doing that either. So they're in a real bind. And I think that kind of brings us to where we are today with the humanitarian situation, at least one aspect of it.
Thanks, Emilia. I mean, you describe a very complicated dynamic of an insurgency that's growing more dynamic and a government response that's struggling at best and complicated at worst. We have some questions from the audience now. I'm gonna combine my pre-planned questions with some of what we've got already. I'm going to start with you, Mamadou. I'm going to plug your Twitter feed here because it's excellent in terms of tracking the humanitarian situation, but also for life lessons. On Sunday, you wrote, you shared a proverb, don't look where you fall, but look where you slipped. And I'm thinking about, we can look at what has happened from 2017 to 2020 and think about mistakes that were made, both from the political and security side, but also in terms of the humanitarian community's response. So what steps do you think we should be thinking about today from the humanitarian perspective? And I know you speak for the ICRC, but maybe looking at the broader humanitarian community perspective, so that we're not 2 or 3 years down the road thinking about mistakes that we made in 2020. What things should we be thinking about in terms of an international humanitarian response to the challenges faced today?
Thank you for that question, which I'll be very happy to respond to. I think there are definitely things that are crucial because this is really a new theater of operation for many aid actors. We were privileged to have worked there for a little longer than most because of the very privileged relationship that we have with the government. But for sure, one is that the humanitarian community must endeavor at best to maintain a neutral and impartial humanitarian space. That means that issues of armed escort, perhaps we need to think about it carefully. We need to separate purely humanitarian action to other actions that have some political overturn. But most importantly, when we interact with the communities, we need to strengthen them instead of creating a situation where they will be dependent on humanitarian aid. What we saw there was quite remarkable, actually. Most of the people who were displaced by this violence, they are not living in big refugee camps as we've seen, or IDP camps as we've seen in other African countries. There is a beautiful form of communal solidarity. I mentioned Makomia earlier. Makomia was a host community. Mosima de Praia was a host community. Today, Pemba is a host community. So they are observing a lot of communities who've left the violence and camps, and they're sharing with them the very meager resources that they have. So our interaction, our intervention in this space must come to support the existing networks of solidarity that are there, the traditional African forms of mutuality that are there, and not weaken them. This is quite important. For us, it's crucial. We are very happy that the UN is now coming on board because WFP, for example, and FAO, they're doing an amazing work when it comes to food, and that gives us also the opportunity to focus on livelihood. So there is some complementarity there among the responders that we also need to maintain.
I'm going to do a quick follow-up on that. We have a question from Pierce from the International Crisis Group. We talked a little bit at the onset. You both mentioned how the violence has gone from rural communities to the district capital level. And now we're talking about people moving into, as a coping mechanism, moving to host communities. How does that affect the security situation if the population is moving to the district capitals and the violence is also moving to the district capitals? How do you see the security for those displaced? And are you seeing any multiple displacements of people being forced to move, from the village to the local, the local town, and then from the local town to the district capital? Are we seeing that kind of pattern of displacement?
Maybe I can take that one. It's the clear pattern that we see now. There are very seldom people who fled only once. You've seen multiple forms of displacement, and the sadness about multiple forms of displacement is that once you are displaced on the first instance, you make your way, let's say in Macomia, you start rebuilding your life. You start the process of restoring hope for your family and for yourself. And then if that town is attacked again and you have to move, leaving everything behind to build from scratch again, you can see at term, it weakened all the strength of these communities. In Macomia, I met personally some communities who I was quite surprised, but happily so, because when we first met them, we thought that they were hosting their relatives, and then during the discussion, we realized that actually these people are not their relatives. Not only they're not their relatives, they're not even they don't even have the same religion. So the host guy was a Muslim, and he welcomed some Christian families who came, and they were sharing everything they had. That's quite powerful for me. The second thing that we've noted with relation to this displacement is because it was very unsafe outside, outside, deep into the countryside. People who were displaced in, let's say, in Macomia, to sustain their livelihood, they had to go out a little bit in the forest, and they start cutting the woods to make charcoal to sustain some livelihood. And you can just imagine, if this is protracted for a long time, what it will do to the environment itself. But maybe we can come back to the climate aspect later on.
Sure. I want to turn to you, Emilia. We have a series of questions from our audience asking about the potential regional spread, both within Mozambique, but also into the neighboring countries. You ran a scenario exercise last year thinking about how this could play out. And I'm wondering, thinking through what you understand about the attempt to regionalize and internationalize this issue, do you see the insurgency spreading beyond this particular province? And secondarily, now that SADC has been engaged to a certain extent by the government of Mozambique and has had some consultations on it, we have questions here about what role SADC can play in helping to address the crisis. Does SADC have that capacity, or is it kind of beyond the scope of the institutional structure there? So turn to you for that.
Thank you. So first, your question about the potential for spreading. I think in the short term, what we've seen in the group's public statements and observed sort of in their operations, they still seem very focused on their little corner of Cabo Delgado today. Even as much as, I think it's interesting, as much as ISIS international propaganda is focused on potential intervention from other Southern African countries, South Africa in particular, threatening South Africa, we haven't seen these fellows in Mozambique say a word about that, not publicly, as propaganda. So I get the sense that they're still very much focused there. So for me, the most immediate question would be the potential for spreading to neighboring provinces over time. We already see reporting in press that they recruit out of Nampula, a neighboring province, particularly in the coastal areas. So there's already a connection there. I think the question is, what conditions, the conditions on the ground that led to this insurgency, are they mirrored in other provinces? Or perhaps more importantly, is the group's propaganda sufficient to get people moving in other places? I know that, again, as more people get displaced into neighboring provinces, we see the local authorities increasingly concerned that violence could spread there. We see the very publicly encouraging residents of, let's give the example of Nampula, keep an eye on these guys. Let me know if you see anything shady happening here. Where are these ladies' husbands? Something very suspicious. And that, my concern is that could prompt the government to take actions that turn this into a self-fulfilling prophecy. If they start securitizing, militarizing areas of these other provinces, could they then inspire a similar reaction that we saw in Cabo Delgado? I think when you look beyond into neighboring countries, again, I think the potential spread could be in one of two ways. One is just a simple lone wolf. Some frustrated youth somewhere in South Africa or another country sees what's happening in Cabo Delgado, reads the ISIS propaganda, and figures they'll take a crack at it. There's some early on when the authorities were still detaining suspected fighters and talking about it, we saw reports of the occasional Burundian, a Congolese resident, so forth, turning up among those detained. You can't discount the possibility of potentially some sort of exchange, like a South African youth inspired to go up and join the fight and then come back. That's something that's happened in other parts of the world. It can't necessarily be discounted here either. But I think sort of this, for now, I think the group's vision personally is still building their little state within the province, but you can't discount how other people are reading that and what that might inspire them to do. In terms of what SADC can do and should do, I think the first thing, and there's a lot of talk about sending in troops, but I don't think that's really the best solution at this time. I think while there is definitely a need for a security, there's definitely also need for a plan. So let's say we go ahead and get the insurgents out of a particular area. Well, what comes next? Is there a plan in place to rebuild the school, to rebuild the maternity ward and keep it safe from a future attack? And I think absent that sort of long-term planning, bringing in more soldiers just complicates the situation and creates more targets. I think SADC could help by, maybe they talk to Maputo about developing this more comprehensive whole of government approach. I think providing intelligence, especially if there is a component of sort of cross-border stuff, providing intelligence on comings and goings of suspected individuals, providing for greater border security, providing some of the support to the displaced population to help the government improve its relationship with civilians are all important things that could help start to make positive impacts on the situation without going to the extent of bringing in boots on the ground. As it is, you get the occasional report that people in Cabo Delgado see the soldiers and police that are deployed from southern Mozambique as foreigners themselves. They're so different from the people who are living there. Adding more foreigners may not send the right message and could complicate the situation.
There's a lot of threads to unravel there. I mean, the reporting of not just foreign militaries, but private security companies operating at part of the country is surely a complicating factor. I want to pick up on one thread with you, Emilia, and then we'll come back to Mamadou after. In terms of, at the thinking about root causes, underdevelopment, and a government response that's not strictly security, but also tries to address these questions, it goes without saying that there is a massive energy component to this part of the country. And we have a couple questions here from our audience about both how do you see both, is there a threat to the energy exploration that theoretically, if done well, could have potential benefits? How do you navigate? Do you assess that this is in some way connected to the exploration of those natural gas fields? And what do you think? I mean, what complicating factor does that have for the government's response, given that you have large multinationals operating off the coast there in the exploratory phases?
Okay, so I guess I'll start with the connection to the group and then move on to the threat the group could pose to them. Let's see. It's like this complicated web of underlying factors that drive this insurgency. And I think the LNG investment kind of exacerbated one of them. So when you look at sort of the economic piece of this, this is I believe the poorest province of the country, the province that has the lowest literacy rates, etc. People were already struggling. You have groups that were dedicated entirely to fishing. Their ancestors were on this fishing land. Their life is the sea. You have communities that are traditionally farmers. Their life is on the land. Then you bring in, but all the same, there was still high levels of poverty, to the point where some youth did not have the resources to sort of, to quote unquote, become an adult. Like, you needed to have resources to get married. Now you're an adult. They weren't even able to achieve that. So now you have the introduction of LNG and the potential wealth that could bring. And it sounds like a lot of people, youth in particular, had expectations of how this would work out for them. Rightly or wrongly, they expected that they would benefit quickly from this potential wealth. You had people who had to relocate as a result of these investments, move away from the sea, further inland, and again, with a certain sort of economic expectation that wasn't met, and that potentially fed into some of the frustration that led to this group, kind of fed into this group's growth and existence. We don't have a whole lot of interviews of former members who can sort of tell their story, but that sort of early academic research suggests this sort of aspect to it. In terms of a threat that they could pose to the investments, we already see just people driving on the road, contractors trying to get from one place to another, get hit, and sort of raising insecurity. For a period of time, some of these companies were using the airfield in Mocimboa da Praia, which was quite thoroughly attacked in March, so showing a vulnerability there. They've since found a different airstrip. It's not super impactful in the operations, but still something to consider. And I think another aspect to watch is the insurgent presence on the sea, and to what extent do they build that maritime capacity and then potentially use that to threaten the LNG more directly. It does sound like the government has deployed their best and brightest to protect those facilities. And it does sound like those investors feel pretty good so far about the security situation, enough to move forward with their investments. But you can't discount just the accidental attack that creates sort of a threat.
Thanks for that. I want to take it back to you, Mamadou, and you volunteered in your opening comments that the violence has escalated beyond the point where we can talk about it as armed violence and to the point where we can talk about it as an armed conflict. And, you know, people who study international law understand the implication that when you start talking about an armed conflict, international humanitarian law becomes applicable with all that entails. So I'm thinking both in terms of thinking about, one, how the government of Mozambique has responded in terms of the concerns about combatant behavior. Two, in the pictures you showed, you showed an attack on a healthcare facility, and that is something that's an extremely troubling trend in armed conflict around the world, is healthcare in danger, that the targeting of attacks. And so I'm wondering if you see the facilities being deliberately targeted, or if that's happens to be a useful target, but it's not an intentional thing. And three, in the context of armed conflict and the responsibilities, we have a question from our audience again about the government's response so far in facilitating the delivery of humanitarian assistance. That is under the conventions, parties to an armed conflict are meant to assist or not impede the humanitarian response. So how would you describe that overall environment in terms of to the extent that you're comfortable with the government's response?
Yeah. Listen, the mere fact that we are there working in places as far as Macomia or Mocima de Praia, moving around freely, delivering humanitarian assistance is something already worth saluting. And the fact that the UN and MSF and others are there able to work mean that the space is opening and other actors are coming. Our message now to all those who are carrying guns in Cabo Delgado from all sides is that Geneva Conventions, the international humanitarian law, isn't just ink on paper from a bygone period. If respected, it does save lives. Earlier, you spoke about prospects for how this conflict will evolve. We firmly believe that when the law of armed conflict is respected, when international humanitarian law is respected, when people are fighting while upholding human dignity, especially those women and children and others who are not taking part of it, it makes prospect for peace later on much more likely. It makes the prospect also of reconciling communities much more possible. So we extend this message to all those who are working there, and we also remind them that when we are talking about upholding human dignity, treating well detainees, not attacking healthcare centers, sparing the lives of those who are injured and allowing them to get medical treatment, not getting engaged in sexual violence, etc. These are not imposition from the West. These are just as Africans as Africans as they can be. They are in sync with our tradition as Africans, and they are very much also in sync with Islam and all our known cultural and religious practices as well. So it's just the right thing to do. This message is something that we hold very dearly, and it is also part of our work to make sure this is upheld.
So we're starting to get close to our time, but I wanted to try to reconcile a couple of questions we have from our audience that will take us from the highly local to the macro level, right? There seems to be some semblance of agreement that at least at some level there are root causes here that are local grievances, right? Underdevelopment, and so we have some questions that are thinking about how do we address those underlying issues, and some questions that are thinking about the fact that we're online today and we have a global audience. They're looking at what is the role for, we talked about SADC, but what's the role for the African Union? What's the role for the United Nations? What's the role for the EU and the United States? The US is the single largest bilateral donor to the government of Mozambique. It's not a massive sum comparatively, but how do we smartly engage at the international level to address the causes that are highly local that might be driving some factors of the violence? So maybe I'll turn to you, Mamadou, first, looking at the humanitarian and the donor piece, and then we'll come to you, Emilia, after.
Very quickly, from our own experience, I personally know of very, very few or none armed conflict that has ended from an outright victories from one party over the other. Those days are perhaps gone. Now, with globalization, the ability of weapons to be sold across borders, the existence of global syndicates, the ability of fighters, armed groups, and others to just have some ancrage in the space, it creates some armed conflicts that are what we call protracted. They last too long. So what the people need in northern Mozambique, let's be very clear, it's not necessarily humanitarian aid. What they yearn for is the ability to restore their livelihood, to restore hope for better future. They want peace, the kind of peace that we all enjoy with our families. And so it is our hope that that peace becomes part of the discussion, the agendas, not just military and security response, but the ability also to invest in people, and the ability to just give people hope for the future.
Emilia, turning to you, I mean, it's a pretty broad question. So I think thinking about what support international community can provide donors, states, multilateral institutions, how do you see that? What's the smart way to engage to try to address some of the root causes?
I think that's a good question, because we do focus a lot on SADC. What can SADC do? Because to us, Mozambique is part of Southern Africa. But historically, this little corner of the country was very much oriented towards East Africa. And it was part of this sort of Indian Ocean Swahili community, like back in the 8th century. So there's still some, I think, historical links that would come into play in trying to better understand the situation and how to help. I think it would be useful to look more towards East African partners, even West African partners who have also tried managing, and abroad. I think any country that has had to sort of deal with jihadist insurgency, they may not be perfect, but they have more experiences that can probably be learned from, what to do and what not to do. I really think that the government needs a strategy. I think define the problem, develop a strategy, and then market it in a way that builds trust with the civilians, that engages the elites that you need to participate. So to the extent that partners in Europe or the US or other countries that have growing, new on the scene, like Mozambique has signed sort of MOUs with India, for example, to come in and help develop that strategy, to a strategy that includes not just, train the security services to be better at their job, to be more respectful of the civilians, to understand that their job is to protect the people, not harm them, give them the capacity they need to do that, the tools they need to do that, but then at the same time, start rebuilding that infrastructure, start investing in the people, education programs. Let's boost that literacy rate, sort of bring that portion of the country into the country, because right now, historically, it's been sort of a backwater, neglected. So I think there's just a lot of social and historical, grievances to address at the local level, but then more broadly incorporating that into the broader country. And that's, I think, a long-term sort of strategic development, and that's where the international community could most help, is just developing the strategy and then providing the tools, or helping develop the tools to implement it.
Before we finish, I just want to give you a chance. We'll start with you, Emilia. Are there any other, we have, as I watch the questions come in, they're sort of evenly split between people who seem to be like from Mozambique and people from our international audience. And I'm curious if there's any sort of last point that you would want to flag for us to think about as we go forward, because I think we are at one of these inflection points where, when I was reading and preparing for today's event, there's a lot of people who are making parallels between what we're seeing in Mali and what we saw in Nigeria 10 years ago, as this is an inflection point now. And so the attention to this issue, I think, is encouraging. And so before we conclude, is there anything we haven't covered that you think would be essential for us to think about collectively as an audience of interest, as we try to come up with ways to support the government in its response and the civilian population?
I think one thing we don't talk too much about is time. And I don't know why the PMCs were brought in, but I suspect it was seen as a kind of a quick and easy solution. We just need more guns. we'll solve this quickly. But studies of insurgencies have shown that even once a government develops a really good plan, it can take 6 years to get to the point where you can negotiate a peaceful solution and sort of wrap it up. So you're right, we're at an inflection point, and it's time to get moving, to develop that good strategy, because it's still likely going to be 6 years out, barring some like wild card that sends this spinning in a different direction. We can still be 6 years out before we see any sort of stabilization or meaningful long-term stabilization. So definitely, this is a good time to start.
Yeah, I mean, before I turn to you, Mamadou, for final thoughts, I would also say, having worked in the humanitarian sector, it's not just that the time now is the moment, but also we need to keep the attention, right? There's a tendency to look from point A to point B. Mamadou, any final thoughts before we conclude? Things that you would want to share with our audience, both in terms of the humanitarian impact, the humanitarian response? And you're still on mute, so.
My kids, they laugh at me all the time when I
You almost made it through without it. Yeah, it was good.
Yeah. So, as we said earlier, it's very important that people understand that winning wars nowadays, it's no longer a matter of capturing bridges, roads, and so forth. The central battlefield now is in the hearts of the population and in their minds. So it does matter how they are treated. It does matter how their rights and their dignity is upheld. I think this is something we have to be very clear. The fact that now you have an increased presence of humanitarian actors, I think it does provide some relief to the population that is, as we've discussed earlier, in dire need. We at the ICRC, we have stepped up our response in the last year, both responding to the armed conflict, now responding to COVID-19 pandemic. As we've discussed earlier, the Pemba has become one of the epicenter of the pandemic. But our hope, obviously, is that some long-term solutions are brought to bear to the table, and that people can start realizing that yes, the night might be so dark, the night might be so long, but soon the sun will rise, and that they might have prospect for better future. I think the region that we are speaking about, we don't look at it just as a war zone. It's an incredible land of opportunity for the country of Mozambique, for Southern Africa, and for Africa in general. And we look forward to the moment where its population will reap the benefit of those resources, so that we don't have just representation from the G5 in terms of investment, but we will see SDGs widely spread throughout Cabo Delgado.
Thank you. On behalf of the CSIS, the Humanitarian Agenda, thank you, Mamadou, for the work you and your colleagues with the ICRC are doing, and for joining us today. We did actually have a question of what is your Twitter handle? So it's Mamadou Sow ICRC. I think you're the only one probably, but maybe not. So at Mamadou Sow ICRC. And Emilia, Columbo, thank you for your time today. And I would encourage people to find Emilia's written products. We had a recent brief in April or May, and then the scenario exercise from last year, which in many ways was unfortunately quite predictive of what we've seen unfold. So thank you very much for your time. And I'll just remind that the event will be posted in its entirety on our website within about 24 hours for people to come back and check it again. Thank you.
Thank you.